The mysterious fear. The galaxy was filled with mercenaries, ruthless warriors for hire who fought wars and carried out missions for the highest bidder. These mercenaries came from many different species, each with their own unique skills and strengths. But there was one group that stood out from all the others, one group that sent shivers down the spines of even the most fearless warriors. This group wasn't just another band of mercenaries. They were something else entirely. These soldiers came from a planet known for its brutal conditions. Their home was a place where survival was a constant struggle. It was a world where only the strongest survived, and even the strongest faced daily challenges that could end their lives in an instant. This was the home of the Deathworlder Special Forces, a group so feared that the mere mention of their name would silence any room. The alien mercenaries, who were known for their toughness and fearlessness, spoke in hushed tones when the Deathworlders were mentioned. Some even went so far as to refuse missions that would involve facing them. No one could explain why the Deathworlder Special Forces were so feared. Their combat skills were extraordinary, but so were those of many other mercenary groups. They had weapons that were far superior to those used by other factions, but again, that wasn't unique in the galaxy. It wasn't just their strength or technology that made them so terrifying. It was something more. The mercenaries who had faced them in battle and survived never spoke of it. Those who had not returned from their missions were assumed to have been destroyed, wiped out by the unstoppable force of the Deathworlders. Stories and rumors began to spread like wildfire. Some said the Deathworlders were stronger than any other soldiers, capable of taking on entire armies alone. Others whispered that they could heal from any wound, making them nearly impossible to kill. But the most terrifying rumor was that the Deathworlders could survive anything. Anything at all. The mercenaries of the galaxy knew that fear was a weakness. In their line of work, weakness meant death. They prided themselves on being able to handle anything, no matter how dangerous. But when it came to the Deathworlder Special Forces, even the bravest among them felt that familiar, uneasy twist in their stomachs. No one knew exactly what made the Deathworlders so dangerous, but the truth was that they didn't need to know. What mattered was that they were afraid. Captain Raxon of the Zorvian mercenaries had heard the stories. He had even heard the whispers of other mercenary groups that had been hired to fight the Deathworlders, only to disappear without a trace. He didn't believe in rumors or ghost stories. Raxon had fought in countless battles across the galaxy, and he had never backed down from a challenge. But there was something about the Deathworlders that kept him up at night, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Every time he thought about facing them, he felt a cold chill run down his spine. The Zorvian mercenaries had just been hired for a new mission. They were tasked with clearing out a small rebel force that had been hiding on a remote planet in the Outer Rim. It was a simple mission, nothing they couldn't handle. But as they prepared to leave, the briefing was interrupted by an unexpected addition to the mission report. The rebel force was rumored to have made contact with the Deathworlders. Raxon stood in front of the holomap, staring at the glowing display. His mind raced as he processed the information. If the Deathworlders were involved, this mission would not be as simple as it seemed. The rebel forces may have been a minor threat, but the Deathworlders, they were something else entirely. The captain's thoughts were interrupted when one of his officers, Talia, spoke up. "Captain, what do you think? Should we call this off?" Raxon turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "Call it off. You don't back down from a fight with the Deathworlders," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. "We go in, we complete the mission, and we don't make the same mistake as those other mercenaries." Talia hesitated. "But Captain, you've heard the rumors. People vanish when they go up against them. What if the stories are true?" Raxon's fists clenched. He had heard the stories, but he wasn't about to let fear control his actions. He had survived countless battles. He wasn't going to let a few rumors stop him now. "We don't know what's true and what's not," he replied firmly. "All I know is that we're mercenaries. We fight. That's what we do." As the Zorvian mercenaries prepared to leave, The sense of unease among them was palpable. It was as though a dark cloud hung over the mission, casting doubt on their every move. They were used to danger, but this was different. Something about the Deathworlders made their skin crawl. They could all feel it, the unease, the fear, but none of them dared to speak it out loud. Captain Raxen watched his crew prepare for the mission, each soldier silently acknowledging the same fear, though none of them would admit it. They had trained for years to face any enemy, to survive any battle, but the Deathworlders were an enemy they had never truly understood. And that unknown was the most terrifying thing of all. As the shuttle lifted off and headed toward the distant planet, Raxen couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap they might never escape. The fear of the unknown was the worst kind of fear, and it was something even the bravest mercenaries couldn't escape. What lay ahead on that remote planet was something far beyond anything they had ever encountered before, and the deadly secret behind the Deathworlders' terrifying power was about to be revealed. But would they be ready to face it, or would they become yet another cautionary tale whispered about in fear across the galaxy? The planet was a barren world, a dust-covered wasteland in the far reaches of the galaxy. Its surface was scarred by countless storms, its atmosphere thin and choking. It was the kind of place no one would visit unless they had to. The rebel forces, however, had made it their home. They had established a small base deep within the rocky canyons that dotted the planet's surface. From there, they operated, carrying out covert missions against the galactic government, hoping to one day bring about a rebellion that would change the course of history. But the Zorvian mercenaries were here for one reason: to end that rebellion. Captain Raxen stood at the front of his team as the shuttle slowly descended toward the rebel base. His eyes scanned the desolate landscape below, feeling a strange sense of unease. The planet was eerily quiet. There were no signs of life, no sounds of movement, and no signs of the rebels. It was almost as though the planet itself was waiting for something, waiting for them. "Captain, we're almost there," Talia said, breaking his train of thought. She was sitting at the navigation console, her fingers tapping swiftly on the controls. "I've run the scans. There's no sign of life nearby, no energy signatures. It's like they vanished." Raxen didn't reply right away. His gaze was fixed on the planet below, his mind working over the information. There was no sign of the rebels, no sign of the Deathworlders. It was too quiet, too empty. "Prepare yourselves," he finally said, his voice low but filled with warning. "Something's not right here. Keep your eyes open." The shuttle landed with a heavy thud, its engines whirring to a stop as the doors slowly opened. The mercenaries disembarked one by one, their boots crunching against the dry, cracked ground. The planet's reddish-brown dust clung to their suits, a constant reminder of the harsh environment they had entered. They moved with practiced efficiency, forming up and scanning the area for any signs of danger. As they made their way toward the rebel base, the silence grew louder. The kind of silence that was unnerving. The kind that made every step feel like it echoed across the barren planet. Talia, who had been walking just behind Raxen, spoke up again. "Captain, I'm not getting any readings from the rebel base. No communication signals, no movement, nothing." "Keep looking," Raxen ordered. "They're here. I can feel it." The mercenaries pushed forward, their hands resting lightly on the grips of their weapons. They were trained for situations like this, where things didn't seem right, where the air was thick with tension. But the feeling of dread that was starting to settle in their bones was unlike anything they had felt before. Then, as they neared the entrance to the rebel base, something changed. The air around them seemed to shift, growing colder, and the hairs on the back of Raxen's neck stood on end. He motioned for the team to stop. "Do you hear that?" Raxen asked, his voice barely a whisper. The others fell silent, listening intently. It was faint at first, barely noticeable above the wind. But then it became clearer, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the planet itself. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't the wind or the storms that often ravaged the surface. This was something else. "It's coming from underground," Talia said, her voice filled with surprise and unease. It's like something's moving beneath the surface." Raxon's heart began to race. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The team had expected resistance, but this was something completely different. "Get ready," he commanded, signaling for the team to prepare for action. "Move in slowly. No one makes a sound." The mercenaries crept forward, their boots light against the ground as they made their way toward the entrance. The rumbling grew louder, now accompanied by a strange vibration that seemed to pulse through the ground itself. It was as if the planet itself was alive, as if something was awakening beneath them. As they reached the entrance to the base, Raxon ordered the team to spread out, taking up positions around the entrance. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every movement felt amplified. Every noise felt louder than it should have been. Talia approached the entrance, her hand hovering over the control panel. She glanced back at Raxon, her face pale beneath her helmet. "I don't think this is the rebel base," she said quietly. "It looks abandoned. There's nothing here." Raxon's eyes narrowed. If the rebels weren't here, then who was? He stepped forward, placing a hand on the control panel, and a sudden jolt of energy surged through his body. The base came to life. Lights flickered on, and the doors to the base slowly creaked open. A loud mechanical groan echoed from within, as though the very structure of the base was waking up after years of silence. Raxon motioned for his team to follow him inside. The interior was dimly lit, with long hallways stretching out before them. The walls were lined with strange markings, alien symbols that none of them could understand. As they moved deeper into the base, the rumbling sound grew louder. It was as if they were being pulled toward something, as if something was guiding them deeper into the heart of this forgotten place. And then they found it. In the center of the base, within a massive chamber, stood a colossal machine, a warship unlike anything they had ever seen. It was enormous, its surface smooth and gleaming, covered in strange materials that seemed to pulse with energy. The warship was clearly ancient, but it was in pristine condition, as though it had just been built. Raxon's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary warship. This was something far more advanced, far more terrifying. And then, from within the depths of the warship, something stirred. The mercenaries froze. They had walked into a trap, but they didn't know yet just how deadly the trap was, or how the true enemy would reveal itself. The Deathworlders had been waiting, watching from the shadows. And now it was their turn to face the ultimate force in the galaxy. The atmosphere inside the ancient warship was oppressive. The walls pulsed with energy, and the dim lights flickered as if struggling to stay alive. The strange alien symbols etched into the walls seemed to glow faintly, as if they had been waiting for centuries to be activated. The air was thick with tension, and every step the mercenaries took echoed in the vast, empty corridors. It felt as if the ship itself was holding its breath. Raxon's hand was steady as he gripped his weapon, but the unease gnawing at him grew with each passing moment. He had faced countless enemies in his career, but this felt different. This warship was not like anything he had ever encountered before. It was ancient, yet powerful, its very design radiating an aura of mystery and fear. "Captain," Talia's voice crackled over the comms. "Something's wrong. The readings, there's a massive energy source deep within the ship. It's growing." Raxon's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected this ship wasn't just a relic, but he hadn't expected it to be alive, or at least connected to something that felt alive. "Move out," Raxon ordered, his voice sharp. "We need to find the source of that energy. Stay sharp. I have a bad feeling about this." The mercenaries spread out, cautiously moving through the corridors. Every room they passed was filled with strange, high-tech equipment, most of it alien and incomprehensible. The ship was a mix of ancient architecture and cutting-edge technology, as if it had been constructed by a civilization far beyond anything the mercenaries could imagine. As they ventured deeper into the ship, the rumbling from below grew louder, shaking the very structure of the warship. The vibrations reverberated through their bones, making their heads spin. It was as if the ship itself was alive, breathing with a force that was too strong to ignore. Suddenly, the mercenaries came to a halt. The corridor ahead of them opened into a massive chamber, far larger than anything they had seen before. The room was dominated by a colossal control panel, surrounded by towering walls covered in the same alien symbols. In the center of the room, there was a massive, glowing object. It was spherical, and it pulsed with a dark energy that sent shivers down their spines. "This is it," Raxon muttered under his breath. "The heart of the ship." Before they could advance any further, the ground beneath them began to tremble violently. The ship's walls groaned and creaked, and an ominous hum filled the air. The mercenaries instinctively tightened their grips on their weapons, ready for whatever came next. And then, without warning, the lights in the chamber flickered out, plunging the mercenaries into darkness. The rumbling escalated into a deafening roar as the spherical object in the center of the room began to glow brighter, the light becoming blinding. "Get down," Raxon yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. But it was too late. A sudden, blinding explosion of energy erupted from the core of the ship, sending a shockwave through the chamber. The mercenaries were thrown off their feet, their bodies slammed against the walls, their weapons scattering across the floor. Raxon struggled to stay conscious, his vision spinning as the force of the explosion rattled his bones. Through the disorienting chaos, he heard a sound, a low, rumbling growl, like the roar of a wild animal. It was coming from the shadows, deep within the ship. And then, from the darkness, emerged something that made Raxon's blood run cold. It was a Deathworlder. Raxon's mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. Deathworlders were myths, stories whispered in the darkest corners of the galaxy. These were supposed to be creatures of legend, beings so fierce and powerful that no one dared to speak their name. But there it was, standing before him. The creature was tall, towering over the mercenaries, its body covered in thick, muscular armor. Its skin was a dark, mottled color, like the surface of a moonlit stone, and its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. The air around it crackled with a fierce energy, as if it could tear through the very fabric of reality itself. It was a being of pure strength, a force of nature that seemed to command the very ship itself. Raxon's heart pounded in his chest as he staggered to his feet, his weapon gripped tightly in his hands. But the creature didn't move toward him. It simply stood there, watching the mercenaries, its gaze piercing through the darkness with terrifying intensity. "Move back," Raxon ordered, his voice hoarse. He didn't know how to fight something like this. He had faced countless enemies, but none like this. As the mercenaries began to regroup, they realized something even more terrifying. There were more of them. From the shadows of the ship, more Deathworlders began to emerge, each one more terrifying than the last. They were everywhere, surrounding the mercenaries, cutting off any possible escape. Raxon's mind raced. These creatures weren't just a threat. They were relentless. And they were not alone. This ship, this ancient warship, had been waiting for them. But for what? What was the purpose of these terrifying beings, and why had they been hidden away for so long? He didn't have the answers, but what he did know was that the mercenaries were not prepared for what was coming next. The Deathworlders were here, and they were about to show them the true meaning of fear. The battle for survival had just begun, and it would be one unlike any Raxon had ever faced before. The tension in the room was unbearable. Raxon and his team stood motionless, weapons drawn, eyes locked on the terrifying creatures emerging from the shadows. The Deathworlders moved with predatory grace, their every step deliberate and calculated. There was no fear in their movements, only the certainty that they ruled this place. Raxon's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. These were the Deathworlders, the legendary beings from the deepest corners of the galaxy. Stories about them had always seemed like fantasy, tales told to scare children. But here they were, real and terrifying, standing before him. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped his weapon, but he quickly steadied himself. There was no turning back now. He had to survive. His team needed him. "Stay focused," he hissed, his voice low and steady. "We get out of here, or we die trying." But as the words left his lips, a low growl rumbled through the air. The Deathworlders didn't speak. They communicated through body language, through intense stares, and the sheer presence of their terrifying energy. Their glowing eyes flashed, signaling to one another as they closed in around the mercenaries. Raxon knew they had to move fast, but every exit was blocked. The ship's walls had somehow shifted, creating a maze of corridors and rooms that seemed to trap the mercenaries inside. The Deathworlders were everywhere, their hulking forms blending into the shadows, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Talia, one of Raxon's most trusted mercenaries, raised her rifle, but her hands were shaking. "Captain," she whispered urgently, "I've never seen anything like this. We're outmatched. We need to retreat. Now." Raxon glanced over at her, his jaw clenched. He could feel the same fear creeping up his spine, but he refused to show it. The Deathworlders were predators. If they smelled fear, they would pounce. They had to keep their composure. "No," Raxon said firmly. "We fight. We don't have a choice." The Deathworlders responded with eerie calm. Their movements were almost too quick to follow as they advanced, their powerful limbs propelling them across the room like shadows in motion. Raxon's heart pounded in his chest. These creatures weren't just strong. They were fast, lethal, and relentless. They seemed to understand everything about combat instinctively, almost as if the very concept of survival had been bred into their DNA for millennia. "Open fire," Raxon barked, his voice carrying authority and desperation. He pulled the trigger, his weapon roaring to life with a volley of high-powered blasts, but the Deathworlder he aimed at barely flinched. The energy blasts bounced harmlessly off their skin, absorbed into their dense, armored hides. Talia fired next, then Vec, and the rest of the mercenaries followed suit, unloading their weapons into the oncoming Deathworlders. But it was futile. Each shot seemed to do nothing more than anger the creatures. "Fall back," Raxon shouted. But before they could take a step, one of the Deathworlders lunged, its massive claws swiping through the air, with the speed of a striking serpent. Raxon barely dodged the attack, the force of the strike causing the floor beneath him to crack open. He rolled to his feet and barely had time to aim before another Deathworlder was upon him. Its glowing eyes bore into his soul, and he felt the weight of its presence like a crushing weight on his chest. The creature snarled, its teeth flashing in the dim light as it raised its massive fist. Without thinking, Raxon fired once more, hitting the creature directly in the chest. But it didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to feel the blow. Instead, the Deathworlder reached out with terrifying speed, grabbing Raxon by the throat and lifting him off the ground effortlessly. His breath was cut off, and his vision blurred as the Deathworlder's grip tightened, its monstrous strength overwhelming him. His mind raced as his fingers clawed at the massive hand around his neck. This was it. He was going to die. But just as his vision began to fade, a shot rang out. The Deathworlder's grip loosened slightly, and Raxon managed to gasp for air. Talia had fired again, this time landing a direct hit to the Deathworlder's head. The creature recoiled, releasing Raxon as it stumbled back, clearly stunned by the attack. Raxon dropped to the ground, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. "Nice shot, Talia," he muttered, pushing himself back to his feet. But the battle wasn't over. More Deathworlders were closing in, their eyes glowing with a cold, calculating fury. They weren't just trying to kill, they were hunting, and they were toying with their prey. The mercenaries were out of their depth, and they all knew it. "Retreat to the ship," Raxon ordered, his voice urgent. "We need to get off this rock before they destroy us all." But as they turned to make their escape, they realized just how trapped they were. The corridors they had come through had shifted once again, sealing off their path. The Deathworlders were surrounding them, cutting off any hope of retreat. They were trapped in the heart of this alien ship, with no way out. And then the unthinkable happened. The spherical object they had seen earlier, the glowing core at the center of the ship, began to pulse with an even brighter light. The air around them crackled with energy, and Raxon felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Something was happening. Something was about to break. The Deathworlders stopped in their tracks, their glowing eyes turning toward the core. They looked almost nervous. Raxon didn't know what was coming next, but he had the sinking feeling that whatever it was, it would change everything. The air inside the alien ship thickened, charged with an energy unlike anything Raxon had ever felt. His body tensed as the pulsing light grew brighter, the eerie glow casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. It was as if the entire ship was alive, resonating with a strange ancient power. The Deathworlders, who had been so confident, now seemed to hesitate, their glowing eyes narrowing in unison toward the core at the center of the ship. Raxon couldn't tear his eyes away from the shifting light. It was as if the very heart of the ship was calling out to something. Something big, something dangerous. The mercenaries were trapped, surrounded by the monstrous creatures, and yet the threat was shifting. The Deathworlders were no longer the only problem. There was something else, something far worse lurking in the shadows of the ship. "Do you feel that?" Talia whispered, her voice tight with fear as she too watched the growing pulse of light. Her rifle was still in her hands, but her posture was stiff, almost as if she feared making a sound. Raxon nodded slowly, his throat dry. "Yeah, something's not right." Suddenly, the core's light erupted with a violent flare, blinding them all. For a moment, the ship's energy seemed to swell beyond control. The very air crackled with power, and the ground beneath them trembled as if the ship itself were alive, awakening from a long slumber. The Deathworlders, once fierce predators, seemed to bow their heads in respect, or fear, as the core's light surged. Then, without warning, the light exploded outward, flooding the entire room with a searing radiance. The mercenaries shielded their eyes, and for a moment, they thought they might be consumed by it. But the light receded just as quickly as it had come, leaving the room eerily quiet. It took Raxon a moment to process what had happened. When he finally opened his eyes, the scene before him was nothing short of horrific. The Deathworlders, once standing tall and imposing, now cowered before the core, their bodies trembling. But there was something else, something even more terrifying. At the center of the room, a massive figure slowly emerged from the shadows, its form cloaked in the light's afterglow. It was unlike anything Raxon had ever seen. Taller than the Deathworlders, broader and far more menacing, the creature's outline was jagged and angular, almost as if it were constructed from the very bones of the ship itself. It was massive, its eyes glowing with an unnatural fire, like molten lava trapped within the depths of its skull. Raxon could see the power radiating from it, the force that even the Deathworlders seemed to acknowledge, but did not dare to challenge. "Holy hell," Talia whispered, her voice barely audible. Raxon felt a chill run through him. This wasn't just another alien creature, this was something far older, something far more dangerous. The ship had awakened it, and now they were caught in its path. The creature's eyes locked onto the mercenaries, its gaze piercing through them like a blade. It didn't speak, but Raxon could feel its presence, pressing down on him with unimaginable weight. The Deathworlders, once fierce and unstoppable, now backed away in terror, bowing to the creature with strange reverence. Raxon's heart pounded in his chest as the massive figure took a step forward. Its movement slow but filled with terrible purpose. It was like watching an ancient god rise from its slumber. "Get back!" Raxon shouted to his team, his voice cracking with urgency. They had no weapons that could touch this creature. It was beyond them. They needed to find a way to escape, and fast. But as they began to back away, the creature raised one massive hand, and the air seemed to hum with energy. Raxon's heart stopped. The ship's walls trembled, the sound of grinding metal filling the air. Then, with a terrifying growl, the creature spoke, its voice deep and resonant, reverberating through the very walls of the ship. "You dare to challenge the blood of my kind." It boomed, each word causing the ground to shake beneath them. "The death of your children will be avenged. No mercy will be given." Raxon's blood ran cold. The creature was not just speaking. This was a declaration of war. The mercenaries had stumbled upon something far beyond their understanding. They had awoken something that had been slumbering for eons, and now they were the ones in danger of being wiped out. "Fall back." Raxon barked, his voice strained. "We need to get out of here now." The mercenaries scrambled, trying to make their way back to the exit, but the creature's presence was overwhelming. It was like the entire ship had turned against them. Every corner seemed to grow darker, every path blocked by more of the Deathworlders, who now swarmed in unison to guard their master. Raxon knew they were trapped. No one could survive this. But even as the panic rose within him, a thought flashed in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. He turned to his team, his eyes steely with determination. "We make our stand here. We fight. This isn't just a mission anymore. This is survival." The mercenaries exchanged looks of fear, but also something else, something that Raxon could see. It was the fire of resistance. They might not win, but they would not go down without a fight. The creature's eyes narrowed, its hand rising as if preparing to strike. The air crackled with tension, and the ship itself seemed to hold its breath. The battle for survival was about to begin. The ground beneath their feet trembled as Raxon's team scrambled to make a last-ditch effort to escape. But the ship seemed to come alive, its walls shifting and moving, as if it were an extension of the ancient creature that had awakened. The atmosphere grew thick with a sense of impending doom, each heartbeat echoing through the cold, metallic halls. The Deathworlders, once so imposing, were now on their knees, bowing to the massive figure that stood at the center of it all. Raxon's heart pounded in his chest as he shouted for his team to move, but the creature's voice boomed once more, sending a shockwave through the air that left them all frozen in place. "Run, and you will perish." The creature's voice rumbled, as though it were coming from the very walls around them. "Stay, and you will be crushed beneath my wrath." The mercenaries exchanged terrified glances, their fear palpable. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but Raxon knew there was no way out. Not now. Not with this creature standing in their way. His mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. The creature's power was overwhelming, and the Deathworlders were completely subjugated. It was clear that their usual bravado had evaporated in the face of something far more dangerous. The alien mercenaries were not just facing any threat. They were facing a force older than anything they could comprehend. And yet there was something inside Raxon, something deep within him, that refused to give up. They were mercenaries, trained to survive against impossible odds. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about survival. If they were going to die, they were going to die fighting. "We have to fight," Raxon muttered under his breath, rallying his team. "We don't stand a chance of escaping, but we might have a chance of taking this thing down." His words had an effect. The mercenaries stood taller, their fear momentarily replaced by the fierce resolve that had driven them to survive countless battles. They weren't ready to give up. Talia, gripping her rifle tightly, was the first to speak. "We have one shot at this. We need to hit it hard, fast, and all at once." Raxon nodded. "Prepare yourselves. We're not just fighting this creature. We're fighting for our lives. Keep your eyes open and stay sharp." With a silent nod, the team fell into position. The creature watched them with its molten eyes, amusement flickering in its gaze. It seemed to know that they stood no chance, but it didn't seem to care. It was toying with them. "We don't need to defeat it," Raxon said, his voice low. "We just need to buy time. Time for the ship to malfunction, or for someone to break through the outer walls. We need to make it unstable." As Raxon spoke, he quickly scanned the room, searching for something, anything, that could help them. He caught sight of the core, glowing brighter than ever. It was pulsing with that same strange energy, the very energy that had given birth to the creature. That was their target. If they could destroy the core, they might be able to collapse the entire ship. The creature seemed to sense his intentions and slowly began to move toward them, its eyes glowing with a sickening intensity. Raxon didn't hesitate. He turned to his team. "Take the shot. Aim for the core." Talia was the first to fire, her rifle unleashing a deafening blast that ripped through the air. The shot struck the glowing core, but the impact was not enough to bring it down. The core absorbed the blast, pulsing angrily in response. The creature's eyes flashed with rage as it raised its hand, and the very air around them seemed to warp. It was as though the ship itself was alive, protecting its master. The walls rumbled and shook as the creature stepped forward, its massive frame casting a long shadow over the mercenaries. "Foolish mortals," the creature snarled. "You will not stop me." Raxon's pulse quickened as he fired his own weapon at the core. This time, the blast was stronger, but still, the core remained unharmed. "Keep firing," he yelled, panic creeping into his voice. "We can't let it recover." But as they continued to fire, the ship's walls seemed to close in around them, the corridors becoming narrower with each passing moment. The creature's presence was suffocating, pressing down on them with a force that made it hard to breathe. Talia's rifle clicked empty, and she quickly swapped it for a secondary weapon, her hands shaking. "We can't keep this up forever, Raxon. We need a plan." Raxon was already thinking ahead. He had no time to waste on doubts or second-guessing. He turned to the rest of the team. "Get to the lower levels. We'll find another way to sabotage the ship from there." The mercenaries reluctantly split up, each heading in a different direction, hoping to outmaneuver the creature's senses. Raxon made his way toward the core, knowing it was the only chance they had left. If they could destroy the ship's heart, they might have a chance to escape this hellish nightmare. But the creature wasn't far behind. With every step Raxon took, the sound of heavy footsteps followed. He knew the creature was close, too close. The temperature in the ship dropped, the air thick with tension. The core pulsed, almost mocking him, daring him to try and stop it. Then, as if fate had intervened, Raxon spotted a weak point in the ship's structure, a conduit leading directly into the core's chamber. It was a long shot, but if he could breach it, he might be able to overload the system from within. Raxon gritted his teeth, his heart racing. It was now or never. "Cover me," he shouted to the others, who were still engaged with the creature's forces. With that, Raxon made a break for the conduit, knowing that the final moments of the battle had begun. The ship would either fall, or they would all perish trying to bring it down. The countdown to survival had started, and only time would tell if they would make it out alive. Raxon's heart pounded as he sprinted toward the conduit. His mind was clouded with fear and adrenaline, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. The creature was closing in, its massive footsteps echoing through the narrow corridors. The mercenaries had done all they could to hold it off, but Raxon knew that the fate of the mission, and of their lives, rested solely on this next move. As Raxon reached the conduit, he glanced back to see the creature looming behind him, its eyes glowing with a sickening, otherworldly light. It was faster than he had anticipated, closing the gap with terrifying speed. The air felt heavier with each passing second, the ship's walls constricting around him like a living nightmare. Come on," Raxon muttered under his breath, desperate to get to the access panel that would allow him to breach the conduit. He tore at the panel with shaking hands, the tools on his belt clinking as he desperately worked. He could feel the creature's presence closing in, each step shaking the very floor beneath him. Time was running out. Finally, with a wrenching sound, the panel gave way, revealing a complex network of wires and circuits. Raxon immediately began to cut through them, trying to overload the ship's system from the inside. Every movement felt like it was in slow motion, as if the ship itself were trying to resist his actions. The creature's voice echoed down the hall, its words full of malice. "You cannot stop me, human. This is my domain. You are nothing." Raxon gritted his teeth and focused on his task. He had no time for distractions. He had to succeed, or they would all die. His fingers worked swiftly, connecting wires and triggering a series of events within the ship's power grid. Sparks flew from the panel as the system began to short-circuit. The ship groaned, and Raxon felt the energy shift, as though the very heart of the vessel was beginning to falter. "Get ready," Raxon shouted to his team, who were still locked in a deadly battle with the creature's forces. He knew that the moment the ship's core malfunctioned, the creature would be weakened, but they would have only seconds to capitalize on it. The air in the corridor suddenly became electric, crackling with energy as the ship's systems started to fail. The creature's footsteps faltered for a brief moment, as if it had sensed the impending change. Raxon's pulse raced. He had one shot. With a final, desperate pull, he yanked the last wire free, triggering a series of explosions within the ship's core. The ship trembled violently, and the entire structure seemed to scream in protest as the energy source began to overload. At that moment, the creature let out a deafening roar of rage, its body contorting as it tried to control the ship's failing systems. It was no longer invincible. The power that had kept it alive, that had given it its terrifying strength, was slipping away. Raxon didn't wait to see if the creature would recover. He turned and ran, ignoring the pain shooting through his legs from the effort. The walls were shaking violently now, and the floor beneath him cracked open in places, exposing the raw, glowing energy beneath. As he sprinted through the halls, the ship seemed to come alive in its final moments. Sections of the ceiling collapsed, and the very walls of the vessel seemed to be eating themselves from the inside out, like a wounded animal trying to heal itself. Raxon's breath came in short, ragged gasps, and he could hear the faint sounds of his team fighting in the distance. The countdown had begun. The ship was going to collapse, and they needed to get out before it was too late. He found Talia and the others, just as they were preparing to make their last stand against the creature's remaining forces. They were exhausted, their faces bloodied, but their resolve was still unbroken. Talia's eyes met Raxon's, and she gave him a nod. They didn't need words. They all knew what had to be done. "Now," Raxon shouted, and with one final burst of energy, they ran toward the escape pods, the ship's interior groaning and rattling with every step. The creature's last desperate scream echoed in the distance, but it was too late. The ship had already begun to disintegrate, its systems failing in rapid succession. The core's overload had started a chain reaction, and nothing could stop it now. The mercenaries reached the escape pods, one by one, and as they climbed inside, the last remnants of the ship were torn apart by the explosion. The shockwaves sent their pods hurtling into space, far from the dying wreckage. They were alive. They had survived. But as they drifted in the cold vacuum of space, Raxon couldn't shake the feeling that the universe had changed forever. The power that had once been so terrifying, the creature that had hunted them with such relentless fury, was gone. But something remained, something darker. The galaxy had just witnessed the fall of a force unlike any other, and now they would have to live with the consequences. The story of the Deathworlders and their final stand would echo throughout the stars, a reminder to all that even the greatest of powers can fall, and that humanity's place in the universe was far from insignificant. As the mercenaries looked out at the vast emptiness of space, they knew that their survival was just the beginning. There were new challenges on the horizon, new threats to face. But they had proved something that day. Humanity was not to be underestimated, and they would never forget the deadly secret behind the alien mercenaries' fear of the Deathworlder forces. The galaxy would remember, and it would fear the day they crossed paths with humanity again.